I will say all your stuff about creative is getting me to working on things. It's just you can't see them yet.
Nice.
Yeah, maybe I am doing things though. For my third grandson's 16th birthday, a month from tomorrow, I'm doing in calligraphy the road not taken by Robert Frost.
Beautiful.
And it's on one page, and his father and his older cousin, or not his older brother and his older cousin, both got the eternal moment. So I decided, well, maybe I shouldn't give the same thing to each of these kids. So, but I have some good ones. So that's what I'm going to give him for his birthday.
That's a nice one.
Good evening to everyone on YouTube. We are going to begin reading momentarily. We're just taking a breath while we wait for others to join us. We are going to begin with paragraph 161. And so there be no doubt from Nick, why don't you read that paragraph?
All right, 161. I must now emphasize the not unimportant fact, which may have also struck the reader, that in the dream, the collective unconscious appears under a very negative aspect as something dangerous and harmful. This is because the patient has a richly developed, indeed positively luxuriant fantasy life, possibly due to her literary gift. Her powers of fantasy are a symptom of illness in that she revels in them far too much and allows real life to slip by. Any more mythology would be exceedingly dangerous for her because a great chunk of external life stands before her still unlived. She has too little hold upon life to risk all at once a complete reversal of standpoint. The collective unconscious has fallen upon her and threatens to bear her away from a reality whose demands have not been adequately met. Accordingly, as the dream indicates, the collective unconscious had to be presented to her as something dangerous. Otherwise, she would have been only too ready to make it a refuge from the demands of life.
Okay, well, this certainly brings up current events. I have spent the last day and a half studying NFTs, non-fungible tokens. Does anybody
Nifties.
know?
What they
Nifties. I'm working on 2 right now.
Are you? Yeah. So I'm now learning what they are too. Good evening, Kathy. Nice to see you. So what this all relates to is people are starting to live in this fantasy world, this metaverse, which certainly takes them away from reality and from lived life. And any comments on that and its implications?
Well, what I've recently discovered, and especially with this paragraph, to stick to the paragraph and then jump to NFTs, if not presented as something dangerous, she would misplace her fantasy world as being the unconscious and then mistakenly reside in the fantasy as if it was the unconscious.
Right.
But presenting the dangerous thing keeps a purity of her unconscious contents coming forth that aren't fantasy. That then leads, I think, to the Nifties, where, once we went off the gold standard, money is a currency of confidence. And the thing is, every currency is related to the U.S. dollar except the Chinese currency. And so pretty much that confidence it doesn't matter. It's pervasive, and it's almost 100% of what is relatable. The thing is, though, with the cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin is one thing, but for example, Ethereum, ETH on the market, makes a way a platform to use Bitcoin. So it makes a platform to actually spend electronic currency more easily and effectively than, say, Bitcoin, which is more expensive. And you can buy partial coins. But I think then what happens is, as you say, the little green electrons, that's all this currency is. And if someone pulls the electrical plug, well, wow, you can't touch your money. So it's an interesting piece there. I laughed that I couldn't get into my own cryptocurrency account after I funded it last April, just for the purpose of minting one Nifty. Well, over the New Year's break, my nephews, 17 and 20, informed me that, well, do you have that 20-word password saved? I said, yeah, that's all you need. So and I now have access and I can look towards minting one. But it's actually kind of cool because I've not been able to look at and use it. I've had to watch it grow to 300%. And then as of yesterday, it was down 6.9%. So it's a loss. So once it goes up, I'll mint the Nifty. But until then, there's not enough money to mint. So
did you mint before?
No, I tried to, and I then couldn't get in through, OpenSea, Coin Wallet, OpenSea into Fortmatic, back to the platform that was minting to then click transfer. So every time I do it, it'd time out because they give me enough windows that I didn't know what to do. So I was just newbie novice. But so I have not minted yet.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of comments I'd like to make. Let's see here. The first thing that's interesting, I find myself wondering what age this woman in consideration may have been, because in some sense, I think it's interesting how Jung always kind of maps the arc of his psychology and his process of individuation as having to do with the first half of life and the second half of life. And as I understand it, the first half of life and the developmental tasks therein are very much geared towards the external world, very much geared towards having a home, a family, a partner, establishing yourself in the world, essentially laying the groundwork for a solid life.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, after 40 or so, it seems like the attention is moved away from the external world and then placed back into the internal world. But it's rather interesting. I know that I struggle with this personally. It's an issue for me where I'm a deeply introverted person, and it's easy for me to kind of recoil away from external life. And I'm younger too. I'm 27. So, in a lot of ways, I have my external life and my foundation set down. But at the same time, it's easy for me to kind of be the hermit more or less and kind of myself. But the reason I say all of that is because I find myself wondering if this might be the case with this young woman here, where Jung is seemingly saying, if the unconscious were presented to her now, it would be dangerous because she would recoil from life rather than establishing oneself in the external world. So that's just a thought. And secondly, on the topic of non-fungible tokens and metaverse and all of that stuff, I mean, it's all interesting, and there's a psychological point there or a kind of strata of consideration. But I think you can make a similar point about almost all social media, and that it encourages people to engage in a way that is so superficial and so narcissistic. And in that sense, I think it's a divorce from reality too, because you never experience the fullness of someone's personage. So I know that it's slightly different from NFTs. Maybe there's some overlap between the metaverse and cryptocurrency and all of that stuff. But either way, it's all kind of this weird splitting in the road between reality and reality, and then reality.
There's a lot of concern out there, especially among parents, and how their children are not being properly socialized.
Your parents? Your kids?
No, parents in general, I think.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah,
My kids are okay.
I'm so thankful to grow up when I did, because I feel like I grew up watching the internet really come to its really kind of reach a peak. And I also was fortunate enough to grow up in a time where I was kind of straddling each world. I can't imagine growing up in a time where I had screens in front of me from the time that I was old enough to really process information, and that was the way in which I had engaged with the world from then on. I mean, it's a terrifying thought, and I'm just, I guess, thankful that I kind of grew up seeing it happen and kind of wading into it slowly, rather than it just being there from the moment that I was old enough to have exposure.
No, I agree with that completely.
Well, let's hear what Jewel has to say about this.
I'm going to say everything that each of you mentioned got my brain spinning. So as a female, you know, I have more words than all of y'all put together, just as an individual. So, okay, back to this. Back to first the topic here. For me, all these words brought back unconscious and collective unconscious. Then it takes me that then to if we talk about individual, and then from individual, it takes us to the collective unconscious. My screen just went out on me for my video, my text. But what I was thinking about was this: at that age, and the world was so small, and the lifespans were smaller as far as communication went, that I don't know, and speaking for myself in the limited way that I grew up, that those two words, collective unconscious, I would have been considered a radical, which I was at one point, probably still am, for not being like-minded. And so for me, about the male and the female of this takes us down even another whole road, because, you know, at least in the 20th century, in not all countries, females aren't all pieces of property that you just, marry off to get the family farm or whatever. And that takes us back to the currency, which I've been following that. And I don't mind telling you, I put a very tiny little bit into to a new bank that was being built. So mad at myself, because if I put the same amount in Bitcoin, I'd be driving a nice car, and house paid off, which then takes me to what Nicholas said. And hello, Annabelle, just join in. I'm the fourth one talking right about our reading right now. And then when Nicholas came in, and he was talking about the part about, the world, the two halves, well, you can see which half I'm in with the white hair. And yes, the first part of our world was dictated on this. Then when I go back to NFTs, I've been studying those. I know somebody that's mined them. They're young people.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, they're the revolters. They're tired of the old patriarchal system or government system. I'll say the females being married off and can't own property or whatever, or have a vote. So they're starting a whole new world. And,
yes, they are.
And then you mentioned, and Gordon, I was aware they've got their own platform on the new ones coming out. That scares me as an individual, when our society, to me, is dominated and ruled by banks. And I've got Nick's a college student. I got to say it. Any college student out there who has a backed loan by the banks, which is backed by our government, who bought out every bank they could in 2008, paid, then they're only paying less than 1%. I forgot how smart to the banks, and they're charging college students. They're going to revolt because they have no voice. They haven't been in society face to face with people, what Nicholas were talking about. They don't have that structure, because I'm thinking, I got to call one of you people to help me. I moved away from the young people, and I need some help with just some tiny technical things. I'm not ignorant, but that's who I think is going to revolt.
Well, yeah, and we're all revolting. You're revolting too.
I guess so, but I always will.
Right. I mean, when you described yourself falling away from the group, that's the definition of individuation, right?
I'm getting there.
Well, and like Mark Twain said, if I ever find myself lockstep with the mainstream, I need to stop and pause and figure out where the heck I went wrong.
Thank you.
I
Yeah.
thought that was Groucho Marx. Isn't there a Groucho Marx quote?
He either was Twain before, it was one or the other. So one of them, T.S. Eliot, the good poets borrow and great poets steal.
Right.
So, God, maybe it was Groucho Marx.
Yeah.
And probably it's
any
been-
club that would let me be a member of it, I don't want to join.
I don't want to.
Right.
I don't want to join. Yeah, exactly.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
Justin has made a couple of good comments here. He says, we've made ourselves totally dependent on electricity and digital systems. One day when it all ceases working due to a solar eruption, we'll be bad off.
Yes.
And my wife said that at some point, Kazakhstan, when they were having their troubles recently, shut down the internet. And then somebody called up the government and said, oh, by the way, did you know that most Bitcoin mining is going on here, and it's a major part of our economy, and we need that. Please turn the internet back on. And the same thing happened to Hosni Mubarak back in the day when the Arab Spring was going on, and he tried to close down the internet, and he found out that bakers couldn't bake bread without the internet anymore.
Because I couldn't order materials, and it had a whole socioeconomic relationship going on.
Right.
Or socioeconomic relationship.
Right. And Justin, wait a minute, I have a problem child here that I have to deal with. And so Justin also says, I'm afraid that the best investment we can make for our own future is in knowledge on stuff such as how to purify water, how to light a campfire, and how to grow potatoes. Yeah, you think? Yeah, I mean, we all need to do that. We all need to know that.
And how to cook using the energy of the sun.
Right.
With reflective things, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how to start a fire with your glasses. I mean, you used to fry ants as a kid, but you could just take them in the sun or with a high-powered flashlight.
Right.
And
Neil says food is the ultimate currency. But I want to go back to my point that actually does relate to this paragraph, which is, the question is, are we starting to make a society that is in fact psychotic because they're living in hyperspace? Now, for me, I don't think that's the case, but the way Jung said this in the 30s, what he didn't envision what we're having now, this experience we're having now. And so, he was basically saying, you have to stay hooked up to reality. And I guess I say, why is that? Right. Some people will be in reality because they'll, everyday running of the world, because they see opportunity opening up for themselves. But why do we have to have everybody not in their iPhone? There's a question for you.
Well, there's the power bill of being connected to nature, and then the creativity and resourcefulness required not to survive, but to thrive without electrical outlets. And I resonated a lot with what Nick said with, you grew up in both worlds, and I'm older, but at the same time, I always, even growing up, said I'm in a bridge generation. Because in college, I would challenge people, if you can beat me drawing that plan on the computer, me rooster tailing the lead off my Mylar, then I'll switch. Of course, it was a stacked deck because the computer was new and I had been drawing since I was 14. So it kind of wasn't fair. But then in the background, I was learning the computer also. So I called it the bridge generation because I grew up drawing by hand. I grew up, with a phone that was connected to the wall, and a recording cassette on a voicemail, was like a big thing. And now it's, how many, I looked this morning, I've got 4 devices. I've got an iPad in my desk that's older. I've got my newer iPad. I've got the MacBook Pro, and then I have my phone. Yeah, and I keep one of them, the older one, just off my own personal network, so that it's kind of the bank, as you will, the storage device in a way. But even so, that idea of a bank is older. And over New Year's, I had a pretty long conversation about, okay, cool, electronic, nifties, cryptocurrency. I said, what's the basis of value? And it finally popped out. One of the people said, it's all just about rarity. So what you have is a culture of individuals. Everything becomes different. But then what happens is that systemic individualism, not individuation, actually becomes pretty boring, banal, normal, mainstream. And so everything being different, in a sense, keeps a lot of things off kilter because they don't dig roots. So my concern is the quick fixes have shallow roots where everything's new. Well, what about, first year roots, second year foliage, third year flowers and fruits, and then the garden naturalizes 4 years afterwards. And so I think that's one of my concerns. I'm with you, Skip, in regards to this being problematic and leaving the question open too about how, as I think Colleen put it, there is no rootless flower. So the flower is this glorious, beautiful, temporary, delicate thing that falls off and comes and goes, but there's a stem and leaves and there's always roots. So the quick fixes have shallow roots of everything being so fast, and you can get drowned in a news feed if you allow yourself to nip on it for more than
our problem is that we have roots that are wires now, and they can be unplugged.
Is it freedom was the phone attached to the wall.
I guess that's not such a great risk, but I think that people need to think about teaching those basic functions, like how to build a campfire, that sort of thing, because humanity did squeeze through a eye of a needle at one point where they thought that the total population of the world was around 2,000 people. Okay, and that was a couple of 100,000 years ago. That's where we now point to when we talk about Eve being the first, being the first human. I mean, humans existed long before that, but then there was this huge die-off, and only 2,000 humans survived, and all of them and all of us are descended from that one first woman, as I understand it. And so, maybe we don't have to worry about people being idiots so much because, they're just, picking themselves for the Darwin Award.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, it's like the Tonga volcanic eruption, most likely salt water poured into a cavern, and that's a TNT level explosion. I mean, throwing water on hot coals in a closed environment, and that's a bomb. Yeah. That's a blast. And I think they said it was 100 kilotons or 10 kilotons. Basically, it was, I think.
No, it was 100 times. It was
100 stronger than Hiroshima. Yeah.
Hiroshima. Yeah. And that's a big bomb.
Yeah, it was heard all the way to Alaska. I mean,
yeah.
Somebody read the next.
Yeah,
sure.
I'll read the next paragraph and let Annabelle get acclimatized here.
Nice.
Okay, in judging a dream, we must observe very carefully how the figures are introduced. For example, the crab that personifies the unconscious is negative in that it walks backwards, and in addition, holds back the dreamer at the critical moment. Misled by the so-called dream mechanisms of Freudian manufacture, such as displacement, inversion, etc., people have imagined they could make themselves independent of the facade of the dream by supposing that the true dream thoughts lay hidden behind it. As against this, I have long maintained that we have no right to accuse the dream of, so to speak, a deliberate maneuver calculated to deceive. Nature is often obscure or impenetrable, but she is not, like man, deceitful. We must therefore take it that the dream is just what it pretends to be, neither more nor less. If it shows something in a negative light, there is no reason for assuming that it is meant positively. The archetypal danger at the ford is so patent that one is almost tempted to take the dream as a warning, but I must discountenance all such anthropomorphic interpretation. The dream itself wants nothing. It is a self-evident content, a plain natural fact like the sugar in the blood of a diabetic or the fever in a patient with typhus. It is only we who, if we are clever and can unriddle the signs of nature, turn it into a warning. You want to comment on that one, Nick?
Well, it's really interesting. This is something that I go back and forth on myself. And I think it's always up to the dream to kind of tell you what it wants from you. But I know that I've had a lot of dreams before that when I try to work with them, it feels like I need to actually kind of dissolve them into their constitutive elements, break it down, and kind of discriminate whatever pieces might be contributing to the dream as a whole. And then there are sometimes when I have a dream and I feel like I ought to probably just take it holistically. I should just take it as a whole, and it speaks a somewhat direct language.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how the dream kind of orients the dreamer to whatever is happening or whatever is meant to be communicated through the dream. But that's certainly unique to Jung. I mean, I think that Freud always thought that dreams were just the idea of the dream facade with Freud was that dreams are imagistic representations of feelings that we don't allow ourselves to feel or thoughts we don't allow ourselves to have. In order to make them even somewhat acceptable, they turn themselves into the dream that we have at night. And what's really behind the dream is something much more malevolent than the dream itself, which is interesting. And then Freud, and then Jung seems to say that, no, the answer is right there in the image itself.
Mhm.
Just fail to see it. And it's really interesting too, also to think about that kind of, I've probably said this before. In fact, I remember us talking about this, but it's interesting when you even look at a story or you watch a movie or even in something like the Bible, the beginning is, the end is already in the beginning. The answer is kind of already in the question. It's already all right there in the seed at the very beginning of things. And I think the same is true of a dream, where what it's attempting to say is right there, and it's so obvious and it's so clear that we just miss it sometimes. So those are
Right. Well, it also is asking us through our conscious mind to make our own judgment about what it means. So, for example, if I take my police car vision that I sometimes get, that to me says that my unconscious has conflated that police car, not police generally, but that police car going across in front of me with the word police across the side of it. has conflated that image with predator. Okay. Now, it's not saying that predator is good or bad. Okay. What I've come to recognize, though, is when I have that image comes up from my unconscious, it's saying, this predator is present. Now you have to decide what to do about that. Okay. Because sometimes when a predator is present, it means, okay, the predator is going to have a full dinner on a carcass or something, but when they finish, there's still going to be meat for you, type thing, right? Coming up from antiquity. And so the predator isn't necessarily always bad, or it may be a predator that can save you from another predator or something like that. And so it is a presentation, as you say, it's a presentation, not saying good or bad, just saying is, right?
I really resonate with that, especially the way you've put it this time, Skip, with the police vision that you have as a predator, and not meaning that police are predatorial or that police are predators, but that this is a very intense influence potentially in your upcoming experience. And you choose whether to engage it and slow down and don't get a ticket, or how you bring that into your life. So that the word predator, we kind of can denegativize it, and predator just seems to then be just an intense influence potentially upcoming in our environment.
Right.
And then we still have, our judgment and will about how to handle it.
Right. We have our 21st century judgment about what it means.
Right.
Right. Because it comes up from the deep unconscious. It isn't something that I got yesterday. Right. Not that the image must have been coming up in my great grandparents, but it would have been different. It wouldn't have been black and white with the word police on it. It would have been something else.
Well, I had an experience in college where a friend of mine was stopped, yanked out of his car, had the just tar beat out of him by the police. And then you hear on the speaker, from the car, from his partner, stop. And they come over, they got the wrong person. And I remember my uncle, who was a Houston police officer, was still alive at that point. And I told him, I said, now every time a police car is behind me, my legs get a little weak. Like I just had a vertigo, like, oh no. And he said, and he started reading off percentages. And he goes, the news is only telling you about those real bad apples, but they're not telling you about all the other people. They said, it's just like the military. They're going to make news out of this sensational stuff. But in a sense, he talked me out of it. And the next police car that was behind me, my legs didn't go weak. Because I had a perspective that, I just happened to experience a rarity.
Yeah. And, we see that in Minneapolis with the George Floyd thing. Obviously, they're not all members of the Minneapolis Police Department are bad apples. And, and at least 2 of the 4 policemen were there in their first week of actual being in the field. And so in a sense, they were sort of like deer in the headlights, you could think of them, right? They didn't know how to react to their senior who's doing this and so on. They didn't have any experience to call upon, and they, they need that experience. I mean, what happened was that Derek Chauvin failed them because he was the guy that was supposed to be protecting and guiding them to protect George Floyd. And he was the experienced guy that was there to teach them, but he taught them the wrong lesson, right? And
that brings up the question then of which pair of those officers were living in the fantasy land. And it's really the ones who had the experience were in the fantasy land of this malice and dogmatic racism, etc., just this us and them BS, versus the new naive officers with less experience weren't living in the fantasy land, but like you said, they didn't yet have the experiential tools to enact what they knew was right.
Yes. Right.
I wanted to say something going back to the text, though.
Go ahead, Annabelle.
I feel like we're off on a tangent a little bit.
All right.
Talking about
That's
Jung.
my job to take us off on
I'm
tangents.
gonna try. Well, sometimes you try to bring us back, but I can see you need help sometimes. There's the idea that nature is not deceitful, and yet man is deceitful. That he pretty much lays out as a statement, as if it were fact and as if we're all supposed to go along with it. And that just makes me think of things like poisonous mushrooms, or, you know, any number of natural phenomenon that are there in our environment to poison, kill, maim, all sorts of things. And I wonder what, you know, what we all think about Jung using that as a kind of platform he's going to move from, when I don't think we're all in agreement about it.
Well, just one observation. Poisonous mushrooms are not deceitful. They simply are poisonous.
Well, but some of
mushrooms.
them, the ones that the particular mushrooms I'm talking about, are the ones that mimic the other ones, you know, where you've got two different mushrooms. One is poisonous, one is not. That's deceit. That's what I mean.
And I think, I sort of agree
not
there.
Not all poisonous mushrooms by any mean. I'm just talking about the use
The mimics
of deceit. Yeah, the functioning of deceit in nature.
Well, nature is a harsh teacher, and to again personify.
Another way of saying what I'm saying. Yes,
exactly. And nature will kill you.
Will punish you.
But when you're out there looking for something to eat, well, you hang out and watch what the bears and the deer eat. And then you watch them walk by. Why did they miss that mushroom? It looks just, well, they're growing right next to each other. And so the mimics, even, you're right, there's somewhat of a deceitful piece, but I don't think nature is deceiving. I think nature is adapting. And so this poisonous mushroom is trying to stay alive by being grounded near the ones that it's mimicking.
That's a deceitful game.
Right.
But then think about a hurricane, you know, or think about a tornado or something else that comes from essentially out of the blue, right? That's nature, blue sky nature, and then boom.
We don't have to. It's my feeling that we don't have to think too literally about this. I think he's just trying to make an analogy between man and nature, saying that, you know, nature doesn't have a persona, doesn't try to make itself appear any certain way. It is what it is. Doesn't waste any energy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
so we can trust
resonate with
nature.
that.
We can trust nature then, would you say?
No.
See, I don't think nature even has trust. It's something I learned to use in my readings to eliminate projection and transference, is that nature has no emotions. Nature only has weather. So in that sense, I just listen to the person's weather, but it doesn't enter my emotional body, so to speak, to get reactions or responses. It becomes more of a nature just simply sees everything as it is. And I would look at it as almost a blue jay animal totem. The totem of blue jay will teach you regardless. Malicious, but
those blue
large,
can be really nasty. Yeah, that's true.
And
that reminds me of something I heard recently, which was that there's no such thing as bad weather. There's just a bad wardrobe. That if you don't have the right clothes to go out in it, that's your problem. Nature is just being nature.
Well, completely.
We have to remember that Jung is talking about dreams here, and I think it's von Franz that also said, and maybe she's quoting Jung, that nature doesn't waste any energy, and a dream is just an object of nature. So I think what I've always taken from that is that, yes, it's quite true. It doesn't seem that any energy is ever wasted in nature, but also that if we pair that with this notion that man is deceitful, well, it's like Maybe there's some really natural communication happening in dreams, and man is just so deceitful, so defended against seeing himself that he'll do anything not to receive that communication, not to turn and look at himself and look at one's own soul.
Well,
Yeah.
yes. And I think to
Okay.
complicate really quickly, if I could, just to complicate, to go back to Annabelle's mimic idea, and even with the blue jay, they're notorious for mimicking a red-tailed hawk
Right.
behind a tree to a rabbit that freaks the rabbit out, makes it run, tires it out. And when the rabbit can't go anywhere and can't find a hole, you kind of hear this cackle laugh and it flies off. But that's almost manipulation. So in a sense, there's this personification piece with humans, but I kind of think that animals play like that too. And some of them aren't so good. You know, some of them are
Yeah.
bullies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Annabelle, why don't you read 163? Let's keep going.
Sure. But a warning of what? Of the obvious danger that the unconscious might overpower the dreamer at the moment of
Crossing.
And what would being overpowered mean? An invasion by the unconscious may very easily occur at moments of critical change and decision. The bank from which she approaches the river is her situation as known to us so far. This situation has precipitated her into a neurotic deadlock, as though she had come up against an impassable obstacle. The obstacle is represented by the dream as a perfectly passable river. So things do not seem to be very serious, but in the river, most unexpectedly, the crab is hiding. And this represents the real danger on account of which the river is or appears to be impassable. For had she only known beforehand that the dangerous crab was lurking somewhere else or have taken other precautions, in the dreamer's present situation, it is eminently desirable that a crossing should be made. The crossing means, in the first place, a carrying over, a transference of the earlier situation to the doctor. That is the new feature. Were it not for the unpredictable unconscious, this would not involve such great risk. But we saw that through the transference, the activity of archetypal figures is liable to be let loose, a fact we had not banked on. We have reckoned without our host, for we forgot the gods.
Okay. You want to comment on that, Annabelle?
No.
No. Well,
I mean, if we really decided the crab is that bad, this backward walking crab, I feel like.
well, the crab's pulling her back into the river in the
Right.
dream, and that's the
Right.
frightening part.
I think it's always important to note also with Jung, and I think we've talked about this before, but it's that you'll never, if he had another patient who dreamt of a crab doing the exact same thing, he might say something completely different about that crab.
Precisely.
There's no fixed meaning for any of the things that one might dream
Okay.
about, and it's
Yeah.
situational, contextual, and up to the individual dreamer.
Mm-hmm. And I think he's putting forth in this case the crabs in a bucket mentality. When one tries to crawl up and out of the bucket, the other ones will pull him back in, or pull, and so there's that piece. But then when he says, we have reckoned without our host, for we forgot the gods. So the crab is, we have forgotten the unseen thing that will influence us. So then I think in that sense, there's an equation or equating of the crab with, in a sense, a deity or a god, that she doesn't know it's there. It's very there, but she can't see it. And so the unseen forgot the gods becomes, I think, critical in this case.
Yeah. Kathy Kerr makes some good comments here. She says, I think nature knows exactly what she's doing. There's an intuitive long-term check and balance system at work toward homeostasis, like our bodies and all other organisms. Mighty Man responds, I totally agree, Kathy. Kathy then goes on, it looks to me like the recent abundance of active volcanoes is the Earth's way of cooling herself.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Wow.
pretty definitely.
So I watched the Jupiter Enigma last night about the mathematical model they put together about the origin of our solar system.
Is that a
And
film?
yeah, it was on Amazon Prime, the Jupiter Enigma, movie length. And it was interesting because we look at our solar system with the orbits there now, but Jupiter allegedly, I'm not sure, it sounded sound, moved out to a larger orbit, and then there were more planets formed by all the ability for the dust and water in the middle ground between the sun and Jupiter having more room, not being affected so much by Jupiter's gravity, to form more planets. But then Jupiter's orbit then contracted over millions of years. And what happened is then these planets were brought into line with each other and collided, and they would either explode and exchange energy and become larger, or here's the asteroid belt origin. Where did all those pieces come from? And they find two distinct types of asteroids, one in the outer belt and one on the inner belt, that are relative to possibly how Jupiter influenced. So I think that Kathy Kersey, nature knows exactly what she's doing. Coming back to homeostasis, there was this expanding orbit, contracting orbit, in a sense, a giant solar system level heartbeat over eons. And then the asteroids created by planets that are now no longer colliding with one another, but still remaining in that orbital pattern. So
Yeah, and the truly magnum way of looking at things, it's the whole universe operating in that way. It's not only
yes,
our solar system.
right.
And what we're seeing now is only, this is what happens after 13.7 billion years. We don't know what happens after twice as long.
Mhm.
Jewel, do you want to take the next paragraph here?
Let me see if it'll pull up.
164.
Or Jewel, did you have
You said-
something to say about the Jupiter Enigma? I saw you kind of nod.
No, that'll be fine. It'll all come back together later.
All right.
But thank you. 164.
Yes, ma'am.
Our dreamer is not a religious person. She is modern. She has forgotten the religion she was taught. She knows nothing of the moments when the gods intervened, or rather, she does not know that there are age-old situations whose nature it is to stir us to the depths. One such situation is love, its passion, and its danger. Love may summon forth unsuspected powers into the soul, for which we had better be prepared, really, and in a sense of careful consideration of unknown dangers and agencies. That is what is in the question here. From a simple projection, love may come upon her with all its fatal power, some dazzling illusion that might throw her life off its natural course. Is it a good thing or bad, good or evil? That will befall the dreamer, without knowing which she feels she is already in its clutches. And who can say whether she will be able to cope with all this complication? Until now, she's managed to circumvent such eventually, but now it threatens to seize hold of her. That is a risk we should avoid. Or we must take the plunge if we need a good deal of trust in God or faith in a successful issue. Thus, unsought and unexpected, the question creeps into one's religious attitude to fate.
Oh.
Powerful.
Yeah.
That I really like that this brings in, because Nick, you mentioned religare, or the religious, root last week, and here religio in the sense of careful consideration of unknown dangers and agencies. Could you speak to that a little bit in regards, because I think it seems to segue with and enhance and amplify what you were even saying last week about you consider religion to be, and then fill in the blank. That seemed to connect to me with what you said last week.
Yeah, let me read through the section really quickly. Yeah, well, it's really interesting that, just to take the last line of the previous paragraph, we have reckoned without our host, for we forgot the gods. And it's almost as if Jung is saying that, the unconscious is greater than the small conscious mind, and that we're always faced with the threat of being overwhelmed if we don't work out a proper relationship to it. And in that sense, we've reckoned without our host. We've forgotten truly how powerless we are. And
everybody that's fallen in love at first sight knows this experience. Or when the honeymoon period finishes, then you find out who you're actually married to. Because the gods made you fall in love with that person, or the gods made you marry that person. But now, what is this person that I'm married to? And that's where the hard work comes in. And we haven't taught our children that that's going to be necessary and why it's necessary. And we need to.
It's also interesting to note that I think last week we were talking about religare as a linking back to one source, and now religio or religio as the careful consideration of unknown dangers and agencies. But either way, there is the connection to that which is more powerful than we are in both cases, or in both etymologies used for the word.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Jung talks about the religious attitude, and I think that's a useful distinction. And I understand that, as always, the use of the word religion, probably now more so than ever, arouses a serious distaste in a lot of people. But I think if you take it in the psychological sense, or in the sense that Jung means with the religious attitude, it's an attitude of reverence, and it's highly, highly appropriate.
Mm-hmm. I like the attitude of reverence. I like that, because that's an activation of the returning to source, or that how we relate back to source.
I never heard any pastors say anything like that. And they're the ones that get to interact with young people most often when they're falling in love. Points here. Patrick Hollywood says emotions like fear and love are carried out by the limbic system, which is located in the temporal lobe. So one could argue love and hatred could be one and the same. Mighty Man says love is real. Yes, definitely. Patrick Hollywood says, I am still trying to figure out how religion helps as much as it hurts, if that makes sense, which is why skip is important for families not to be broken up. The children learn from their parents how to overcome trials and tribulation and get through arguments. Very nice. Well, thank you.
That's a wonderful comment.
I mean, this is the point, because, I never heard any religious person really try to put, even in religious terms, even in terms of Christianity, what are the risks of marriage? What do you have to deal with in marriage? My first marriage, we had a pastor who, we had to spend an hour with him as a condition of getting married. And, basically he just said, well, you like each other? Yeah, well, have a good life. That's basically what he said. I don't even remember a word of what he said, but none of it was like this. None of it was like a warning that, oh, by the way, the woman you're marrying is a third child, so she sees things differently than you do as a first child. You know, that's a big deal, turns out.
I think, to be fair, you expect maybe too much of pastors or people in that position.
Well, but this is the role that they've set themselves up to do over thousands of years, and it's only in the last 100 years that psychotherapists have figured this out. And
Yeah,
so, they didn't figure it out, but you know,
I mean, I don't know how many psychotherapists you would go see that would say, right, you know, you've projected your anima onto this woman that you've fallen in love with, and now that projection has fallen back into yourself, and you just see the human being that's there before you, and you've got to learn how to love that person. Well, I don't know that many psychotherapists that are going to say that to you either.
Hopefully they would say that before you get married.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, my grandfather, I remember he was a Methodist minister for 66 years. And the thing is, Methodist ministers also function as capital C counselors within the congregation.
Sure.
And just in the same capacity as a licensed counselor. I mean, they're not holding themselves out as they are that. And I remember I was confused about something, and he said, oh, don't worry about what they're saying. He goes, it's not about jealousy. As long as you don't harm anyone, including yourself, and it's something that you feel is important, then you will build value with it. So go do it. I don't agree with it. I think it's folly, but that's not my choice to make. But then I would hear people tell me what he had told them in counseling. And it would be, Nick, just like that. He would say, well, I do think I'm noticing a very, very high degree of infatuation in these three areas. And he would call them out on examples. But then I noticed a lot of validity in these other two. So I would suggest to develop the validity part and try not to fool yourself with the folly of the infatuation. I mean, things like that. And I remember just going, well, can I get in a relationship to get counseling? Because that was really cool what he just said to them. Because it was just dead on honest, whether it was right or wrong, true or untrue. It was powerful and it was insightful. But I gather, though, and to your point, it's probably more rare than not, because it's probably
even more rare than a pastoral counselor who's prepared to say that would be a fit party to receive that insight. I mean, I don't know how many people you could say that kind of thing to that would be like, oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, they just will never come back.
Anyway, it's too late when you're, you know, on the steps of the church for marriage. I mean, I was, and so I didn't have any experience with this minister. When I got married the first time, I just wanted to be married before I went to Vietnam. That's all. And you know, I wanted to have an experience with a woman, and I was keeping in mind that I was in the last class of the Victorian era, so I wasn't, you know, albeit I might have tried a few times, but I never had any real sexual experience before my marriage, and so being 2 days before the wedding that my wife had been planning for 3 months while I was in the basic school, how was that going to get stopped? You know, how was that going to get thought about? Right? You know, it's just okay. I
want to add something that tells me so much about what we've talked about the whole evening. When the church was set up, you know, at some point, you know, we know all about the roles and all of that kind of stuff. But as we're talking about how society's changed and everything, we've talked even about currency, we've talked about the technology. We've got a generation growing up that doesn't know how to have relationships.
Yeah.
And for me, I I am really an introvert, but you get me with the certain people and I can just talk, but I can talk to a crowd very easily. But, well, if you know all that kind of stuff. But where I'm going with that is it helped me just in this talk when I've said several times, I can't understand why all these people that are coming out saying, you hurt my feelings. And I'm like, huh? And you're going off to war and what? And, go marry some girl. And then you and I grew up in a time where it was so different. And I'm really worried, as we said earlier, where is our world going with this? And why I say nature, I called it the other week, the circle of life. I see everything that's happening worldwide, country, and all of this. And are we recreating everything we've always created and then destroyed?
Sure looks like it right now.
And back to this. Well, that's where I am going with. What is the role of these people
up there, Jewel?
Today, talking to the people when everything's different, help me get to understand what Carl Jung would be telling me now in my dream when it was way out there. Would that mean that everything that I got in that dream may mean something?
Yeah, everything means something.
Okay.
Everything that's in a dream or vision is a message to you from your unconscious, everything.
Okay.
Well, Jewel, to your point of just the what are we doing, and this culture that by and large doesn't know how to relate to one another, much less have relationships. There's a lot of entitlement, lack of boundaries, zero discernment, concern for others. Now, you'll have a lot of people that are just wonderful. I mean, but if I look back sociologically, 3 generations ago, every teenager was tired of this parent telling me what to do. Well, the source of the solution of that is have your rite of passage and become an adult yourself. And then you tell yourself what to do. Except what they did is they didn't rite of passage. And so then they didn't want to, tell their children what to do because they hated it so much. So I'm not going to do that to my kids. And now we've had 2.5 full generations of children in the family, adults afraid of scolding them for lawsuit or social services, and discernment, discretion, and will and conscious decision-making has taken a heavy hit.
Right.
Well, now what with this religious stuff, where are we today? Or I don't know, y'all pull it back together because I'm going to put air in my cheeks, which means I'm going to be quiet. And tie that into where we are today with what Carl Jung was saying then when it was the church was like a god, but they didn't tell you the things about Mother Nature, which was more like Floyd. So anyway.
Yeah, well, they didn't tell you about Mother Nature, and even in school when we had health class in the 8th grade, they separated the boys and the girls so that the guys didn't even know. We wondered for years what the heck were they talking about in there, and right.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
I mean, we finally worked it out, and other guys told us, but why does the health class have to get split up? And it's because we're immature, actually. I mean, when we have the Puritans who want to damn you for the least infraction or put an A on your chest, that sort of thing, they're trying to shame you into a behavior that they want without helping you to understand what you were getting into in the first place.
Well, exactly. I mean, instead of embodying, they markedly disembody, and they basically tell you to shy away from the body,
Right.
And so, in a sense, there's all this head stuff, and they'll talk about the heart, but it's still just a head talking about the heart. But it's not that my whole being absorbing this information to learn and utilize it. So pardon, Nick, go ahead.
Right. So I'm going to read the next couple of paragraphs here.
Go for it. Go for it.
We've been that bad. Go ahead.
The dream as it stands leaves the dreamer no alternative at present but to withdraw her foot carefully, for to go on would be fatal. She cannot yet leave the neurotic situation because the dream gives her no positive indication of any help from the unconscious. The unconscious powers are still inauspicious and obviously expect more work and deeper insight from the dreamer before she can really venture across. I certainly do not wish, by this negative example, to convey the impression that the unconscious plays a negative role in all cases. I will therefore add 2 further dreams, this time of a young man, which illuminate another and more favorable side of the unconscious. I do this the more readily since the solution of the problem of opposites can be reached only irrationally, by way of contributions from the unconscious, i.e. from dreams. Okay, so let's get into this 167.
Okay.
Represents.
Yeah, go ahead, Jordan. Read the next paragraph.
Yeah, I like that we were doing this, Nick, because this plays in a whole nother part and these paragraphs all go together. So paragraph 167. First, I must acquaint the reader in some measure with the personality of the dreamer, for without this acquaintance, he will hardly be able to transport himself into the peculiar atmosphere of the dreams. There are dreams that are pure poems and can therefore only be understood through the mood they convey as a whole. The dreamer is a youth of a little over 20, still entirely boyish in appearance. There is even a touch of girlishness in his looks and manner of expression. The latter betrays a very good education and upbringing. He is intelligent with pronounced intellectual and aesthetic interests. His aestheticism is very much in evidence. We are made instantly aware of his good taste and his fine appreciation of all forms of art. His feelings are tender and soft, given to the enthusiasms typical of puberty, but somewhat effeminate. There is no trace of adolescent callowness. Undoubtedly, he is too young for his age, a clear case of retarded development. It is quite in keeping with this that he should have come to me on account of his homosexuality. The night preceding his first visit, he had the following dream. I am in a lofty cathedral filled with mysterious twilight. They tell me that it is the cathedral at Lourdes. In the center, there is a deep, dark well into which I have to descend. The dream is clearly a coherent expression of mood. The dreamer's comments are as follows. Lourdes is the mystic font of healing. Naturally, I remember yesterday that I was going to you for treatment and was in search of a cure. There is said to be a well like this at Lourdes. It would be rather unpleasant to go down into this water. The well in the church was ever so deep. Shall I read the next one as well?
I'll go and read it.
Okay.
Now, what does the dream tell us? On the surface, it seems clear enough, and we might be content to take it as a kind of poetic formulation of the mood of the day before. But we should never stop there, for experience shows that dreams are much deeper and more significant. One might almost suppose that the dreamer came to the doctor in a highly poetic mood and was entering upon treatment as though it were a sacred religious act to be performed in the mystical half-light of some awe-inspiring sanctuary. But this does not fit the facts at all. The patient merely came to the doctor to be treated for that unpleasant matter, his homosexuality, which is anything but poetic. At any rate, we cannot see from the mood of the preceding day why he should dream so poetically if we were to accept so direct a causation for the origin of the dream. But we might conjecture perhaps that the dream was stimulated precisely by the dreamer's impressions of the highly unpoetical affair which impelled him to come to me for treatment. We might even suppose that he dreamed in such an intensely poetical manner just because of the unpoeticalness of his mood on the day before, much as a man who has fasted by day dreams of delicious meals at night. It cannot be denied that the thought of treatment of the cure and its unpleasant procedure recurs in the dream, but poetically transfigured in a guise which meets most effectively the lively aesthetic and emotional needs of the dreamer. He will be drawn on irresistibly by this inviting picture, despite the fact that the well is dark, deep, and cold. Something of the dream mood will persist after sleep and will even linger on into the morning of the day on which he was to submit to the unpleasant and unpoetical duty of visiting me. Perhaps the drab reality will be touched by the bright golden afterglow of the dream feeling. Well, let me just comment here, because this is Jung, the man of the 19th century, that is making these comments. So I think we've moved along quite a bit farther in terms of what we think. And, probably Jung did have an idea that he could figure out some way to get people who are gay out of being gay, but I think we pretty much established that that's not the case now, but that's just my comment. Anybody want to carry on here?
Well,
Like,
I'm amazed in these I guess it's just in this last paragraph, how many times he used the word poetic and poetical. I don't remember him using that word so many times, and I'm not sure exactly what he means by it, because it almost sounds like he means, I don't want to say dreamlike, but something related to dream, something related to dreaming, because he seems to distinguish between poetic, kind of like experience, and then real experience, the way that I'm interpreting his various uses.
Yeah, I think the Jungians tend to think of the unconscious as a poetic place that uses metaphor and that sort of thing, ideas that are poetic in fact. And so I think that's why he was.
So metaphor is one tool of poetry.
Right.
But
Yeah,
but on the other hand, there are other tools of poetry. I mean, it makes me wonder about I guess archetypes, in the sense that there are other tools of poetry that relate to song, or that relate to folk tales, or that relate to other early, in relation to archetypes, early forms of literature.
Right.
So Jung is telling a story.
He's referring to the imagination in general, I think, when he's talking about it in this way.
I think so. And I think if we refer back to the first sentence in the previous paragraph, the dream is clearly a coherent expression of mood. Right. And when he says the dream is almost a poetical reaction to the unpoetical condition, so to speak.
And he said a kind of poetic formulation of the mood.
Yes.
In that next paragraph. So,
and that speaks to your music and metaphor and all these tools that play into mood rather than intellect.
Okay.
And Skip, I think you're right. I mean, we've come further. It would make an argument of conversion therapy is one of the most evil things to subject someone to.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think it's important to know that while he does, of course, I guess Jung, some of his thought requires an apology for it not being PC, but I think it's also important to note that he's not necessarily, he says, But we might conjecture perhaps the dream was stimulated precisely by the dreamer's impressions of the highly unpoetical affair which impelled him to come to me for treatment.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not like he's trying to convert this guy out of his homosexuality per se, but it's like this guy said, I'm having some issues. I need to come see you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you're actually, that's a good point, because he's not actually being judgy. He's just saying it's an unpoetic condition or experience that the person is going through, not that it's right or wrong, good or bad. So I'm glad you brought that piece up.
Jung had many homosexual patients as well. And
Truly.
also think about how, difficult of a time it would have been to have been openly homosexual as well. I mean,
Oh yeah.
probably not a very receiving culture in which to express oneself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, this was written in the teens, and we know what happened to Alan Turing 25, 30 years later in Britain. So these are issues that are very sensitive at that period of time.
Well, and there's so many stories of people being run out of town. I mean, I can't remember his name right now, but a contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright in Oklahoma, wrong place to be gay in the 50s, or, and he literally, his career was shattered and destroyed, and they ran him out. But it was actually, he did the Price Towers. I can't remember his name. But anyway, he was an amazing creative being. It had nothing the sexuality behind it, to me, was not part and party to his profession. And he was brilliant, genius level.
Can I quickly read what I think is the most important bit of this paragraph?
Go ahead.
Let's see here.
Which paragraph are you in now?
Same paragraph.
Same one, 169.
Mm-hmm.
Just he says so much here, and I don't feel like we've touched any of it really. So it cannot be denied that the thought of treatment, of the cure and its unpleasant procedure recurs in the dream, but poetically transfigured in a guise which meets most effectively the lively aesthetic and emotional needs of the dreamer. He will be drawn on irresistibly by this inviting picture, despite the fact that the well is dark, deep, and cold. Something of the dream mood will persist after sleep and will even linger on into the morning of the day on which he has to submit to the unpleasant and unpoetical duty of visiting me. And it's really interesting that it's almost as if the unconscious of the dreamer presented an image of the goal or an image of the process which he has to undergo, which will serve as kind of a touchstone for him as he goes through this process. And that it happened to also cloak itself in all of this aesthetic imagery and kind of poetic expression that seemingly will appeal to the dreamer. And even though it's deep, dark, cold, a deep,
That's
dark,
good.
cold water.
That's good that you brought that up, because then the unpoetical experience of visiting me, I'm going to take this lush, wonderfully aesthetic, poetic feeling and mood of an experience, and I'm going to subject it to this gauntlet of processes and questions to out the truths, so to speak, and bring it to bear in reality more than just being a dream. As if Jung felt, this unpoetical experience of visiting me, but that it was also important because this dream he keyed in on that, this is an important dream to this individual. The mood, the poetical and the unpoetical in the individual seem to marry and unite to form that dream so that he can bring it to the opposite, the unpoetical session, with Jung.
Yeah, and it's always, I know that Jung and other analysts always make a great deal about the dream that an analysand has either the night before they go for their first session or the night after they've had their first session, because they're always looking to see what the unconscious is communicating to them in terms of their process of treatment and their process of analysis. So I'm sure that Jung gleaned a great deal of information about how he would proceed with this young man from this dream, But it's also interesting that they turn time and time again to a dream to see what the unconscious is communicating to them or how they might work with the individual. And that's both at the beginning, at the midpoint, and maybe even towards the end. And that's particularly interesting because it's markedly different from other forms of therapy, because you might just sit and walk around the same issue for years and years and years and years. And that can be a defense mechanism in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you pay attention to a dream, the dream is always giving commentary on the situation in the present, but also teleologically oriented, in that it's pointing beyond itself. It's saying, here's how you might resolve this going forward.
Well, that's a good point about the dream prior to the session. Put the session on the datum of the zero, and you have the heights, numinous and the phonic, deep. Whichever way they're coming in, they're going to arrive at the session, and then the dream's leaving. And there's a confluence of the rivers of the past that are confluencing with the rivers of the future, and then both and connect at that point. So I'm glad you brought up the dream prior and the dream post, because it's as if you're having a bleeding edge feeling of what the session's going to be. So the unconscious basically comes to the table specifically with the meeting minutes prior to them happening, so to speak, and then leaving, they're influenced by and are driven then into that teleological position. And both and, I mean, it's either or, and it could be neither, but they both seem to be important potentially to look at.
All I can say is, Nick, you're going to be a wonderful therapist when you get your license.
Yes. Well,
go ahead, Jewel.
I'm going to say, and yes, and the next sentence goes right into that. This is where I think a therapist would come in. Perhaps the drab reality, there's so many ways this sentence could be interpreted, so I'm going to start it again. Perhaps the drab reality will be touched by the bright, golden afterglow of the dream feeling. And the beauty of where we are with, I'm going to pick on Nicholas again. You are not in the same world that paragraph 168 ended in. The well in the church was ever so deep. So I have no clue how a minister would have handled that, whatever the interpretation was decided. Where that's what I see with today, what's going on with psychology and neurology, scientists coming together, it's bringing scientific evidence to these feelings. And they're actually something else, the unconscious, yeah.
Yeah, because I think a lot of pastors are not taught about the unconscious at all, if at all, if they even think about it. And so they wouldn't be thinking about the meaning of the deep, dark well in the church.
The other part we talked about earlier was good and evil. Different churches have different beliefs on that. And that's where our new people are coming up. And so I'm curious to see what Carl Jung has to say next.
Yeah, okay.
Wants to read 170.
Shall I read the next paragraph?
Yeah, go ahead, Annabelle.
Is this perhaps the purpose of the dream? That would not be impossible, for in my experience, the vast majority of dreams are compensatory. They always stress the other side in order to maintain the psychic equilibrium. But the compensation of mood is not the only purpose of the dream picture. The dream also provides a mental corrective. The patient had, of course, nothing like an adequate understanding of the treatment to which he was about to submit himself. But the dream gives him a picture which describes in poetic metaphors the nature of the treatment before him. This becomes immediately apparent if we follow up his associations and comment on the image of the cathedral. quote, cathedral, close quote, he says, quote, makes me think of Cologne Cathedral. Even as a child, I was fascinated by it. I remember my mother telling me of it for the first time, and I also remember how whenever I saw a village church, I used to ask if that were Cologne Cathedral. I wanted to be a priest in a cathedral like that, close quote.
Yeah. It's just like when my brother and I went in that Catholic church the first time, and we go, wow, isn't this cool? Look at all this stuff. Yeah.
No, and that's a poignant experience. The first time, and you're in that kind of grandeur that's not just superficial and garish and lavish for no reason. I mean,
It's to be attention getting.
yeah, that's
In
Right.
this case, though, he hasn't actually gone in. I mean, what he's describing is not actually going into it. It's being told about it.
Right.
mhm.
And it's going into village churches and wondering whether those were this magnificent cathedral. So there's a kind of disconnect going on.
Well, he's
Well-
also talking about going into the therapy, though, too.
Right.
Yeah, I
I was
think
going
we,
to say, to Nick's point, his being told about it is to Nick's point, this is the dream before the session, the dream before actually visiting Cologne Cathedral.
Right. Yeah.
I think we need the information from the next two paragraphs before we can say
You want to go?
anything with any certainty. Sure.
Oh, I
Yeah.
will. In these associations, the patient is describing a very important experience of his childhood. As in nearly all cases of this kind, he had a particularly close tie with his mother. By this, we are not to understand a particularly good or intense conscious relationship, but something in the nature of a secret subterranean tie which expresses itself consciously, perhaps only in the retarded development of character, i.e., in a relative infantilism. The developing personality naturally veers away from such an unconscious infantile bond, for nothing is more obstructive to development than persistence in an unconscious, we could also say a physically embryonic state. For this reason, instinct seizes on the first opportunity to replace the mother by another object. If it is to be a real mother substitute, this object must be, in some sense, an analogy of her. This is entirely the case with our patient. The intensity with which his childish fantasy seized upon the symbol of Cologne Cathedral corresponds to the strength of his unconscious need to find a substitute for the mother. The unconscious need is heightened still further in a case where the infantile bond could become harmful. Hence the enthusiasm with which his childish imagination took up the idea of the church. For the church is, in the fullest sense, a mother. We speak not only of mother church, but even of the church's womb. In the ceremony known as the Benedictio Fontis, the baptismal font is apostrophized as Immaculatus Divini Fontis Uterus, the immaculate womb of the divine font. We naturally think that a man must have known this meaning consciously before it could get to work in his fantasy, and that an unknowing child could not possibly be affected by these significations. Such analogies certainly do not work by way of the conscious mind, but in quite another manner. So to continue, the church represents a higher spiritual substitute for the purely natural or carnal tie to the parents. Consequently, it frees the individual from an unconscious natural relationship, which, strictly speaking, is not a relationship at all, but simply a condition of inchoate unconscious identity. This, just because it is unconscious, possesses a tremendous inertia and offers the utmost resistance to any kind of spiritual development. It would be hard to say what the essential difference is between this state and the soul of an animal. Now, it is by no means the special prerogative of the Christian church to try to make it possible for the individual to detach himself from his original animal-like condition. The church is simply the latest, and specifically Western, form of an instinctive striving that is probably as old as mankind itself. It is a striving that can be found in the most varied forms among all primitive peoples who are in any way developed and have not yet become degenerate. I mean, the institution or rite of initiation into manhood. When he has reached puberty, the young man is conducted to the men's house or some other place of consecration, where he is systematically alienated from his family. At the same time, he is initiated into the religious mysteries, and this way is ushered not only into a wholly new set of relationships, but as a renewed and changed personality into a new world, like one reborn Quasimodo genetus. The initiation is often attended by all kinds of tortures, sometimes including such things as circumcision and the like. These practices are undoubtedly very old. They have almost become instinctive mechanisms, with the result that they continue to repeat themselves without external compulsion, as in the baptism of German students or the even more wildly extravagant initiations in American students' fraternities. They are engraved on the unconscious as a primordial image.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to note that on the one hand, how the dream might appear to the dreamer is in the positive sense, maybe a goal, a picture of the goal, a picture of what has to be done and the way in which it might be done. But also you can see how the communication is very different to Jung, where Jung is seeing in that he has to work out his mother complex. He has to work out his relationship and his kind of unconscious identification with his mother, or over reliance on his mother.
Exactly. And then it becomes a prefiguration of the absolute need for his rite of passage out of that into his, whatever his life is as a man.
I'm amazed that he uses that example of the hazing for fraternities kind of a thing. I don't think of that as having existed, especially not so dramatically, such a long time ago.
Well, it's certainly been subject to profanation. But
surely it's existed for hundreds of years.
I guess so.
Yeah.
I mean, things like boot camp, things like men becoming soldiers, things like, there are various religions that have rituals that have to do with becoming a teenager or, other.
Becoming a man. Yeah, I mean.
But this is a very specific one that has to do with men forming alliances, and that makes me think of things like not the Shriners. I mean, my uncle was a Shriner. The Masons, exactly. The Masons, or like the Bohemian Club. I had a very close friend who was a member of the Bohemian Club, or these other male enclosed. I'm making this shape here. Right? Enclosed societies where it's like you have to meet these stringent requirements, which then in the case of hazing for fraternity can be life-threatening.
Oh, well, yes. I'm glad you brought up the Masons, because even in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Masonic Lodge has one of the most intact and wondrously beautiful stage sets for the rite of passage plays that they're required to put together. And so we went and toured, and we can see all the stage sets. Now, we would never be invited to watch the actual play. And but I mean, the dressing up as women and men and boys and girls, and they play all the parts of life. Basically, it's not a fetishy kind of thing. It's an individuation process that initiates them into the Masons.
Yeah.
Yeah, at this point, I think it's important to read what Jung actually thought about about secret societies, however. So this is in
Oh,
Memories,
great.
Memory
Dreams,
Dream Reflections.
Reflections.
Before we get away from the point here,
No, this is the point,
I think this is the
Nick.
point.
This is
That's
the
why
point.
I mentioned that.
okay, right, all right.
I mean, this is the point that Jung is making here that is relevant, and we can come back to the rest of it. But he says the secret society is an intermediary stage on the way to individuation. The individual is still relying on a collective organization to effect his differentiation for him. That is, he has not yet recognized that it is really the individual's task to differentiate himself from all the others and stand on his own feet. All collective identities, such as a membership in organizations, supportive isms, and so on, interfere with the fulfillment of this task. Such collective identities are crutches for the lame, shields for the timid, beds for the lazy, nurseries for the irresponsible, but they are equally shelters for the poor and weak, a home port for the shipwrecked, the bosom of a family for orphans, a land of promise for disillusioned vagrants and weary pilgrims, a herd and a safe fold for lost sheep, and a mother providing nourishment and growth. It would therefore be wrong to regard this intermediary stage as a trap. On the contrary, for a long time to come, it will represent the only possible form of existence for the individual who nowadays seems more than ever threatened by anonymity. Collective organization is still so essential today that many consider it, with some justification, to be the final goal, whereas to call for further steps along the road to autonomy appears like arrogance or hubris, fantasticality, or simply folly. I'll stop there.
And where's that from, Skip?
Page 342 of Memory Streams Reflections.
340. Thank you, Skip.
That's very helpful.
And you can
Very.
find it in you can find the electronic version of it in the Dropbox.
Mhm.
Well, my thinking is like, yeah, that's all great and well. I mean, I've read that. I've heard you read that multiple times. It's a really roundabout way of saying group identification is not the way to individuation. That's all great and well. However, he does not say anything about that in the paragraph that we just read.
Right. Well, Memory Streams Reflections was written 50 years later.
Yeah, but I mean, my frustration is that we read the paragraph, it snowballed into a bunch of different other points. Then Freemasons were mentioned in their group thing, and then somehow we got into secret societies. And it's like all Jung is saying in this is that it's nice to have rites of passage.
Well, yes, but I do agree with Skip bringing that up, because also then further, I mean, when he says an intermediary, so basically a quasi-parent on the way to becoming your own parent, in Man and His Symbols, and I don't have a page or paragraph reference, he says, once the individual has passed his initial test and can enter into the mature phase of life, the hero myth loses its relevance. The hero's symbolic death becomes, as it were, the achievement of that maturity. So I kind of feel like Skip reading that, from my perspective, Nick, it brings in a qualifying finer grain detail necessary to integrate this paragraph into the whole process.
Right.
Regardless of the integrity of, no, it's not in the paragraph.
It's entirely because, what we're reading was written in the 19-teens, and what was in Memory Streams Reflections was written 40 years later, when he changed some aspects of what he was thinking. So that's all.
I mean, there's a through line, but it's much more complicated than that, I think, because on the one hand, I mean, Jung almost always reads like somebody who's got a rather staunch father complex. So of course he would have problems with those exact same kinds of things. And
Yes, he surely did have.
it's also quite interesting that
Times 6 generations.
if the same thing is true about us, the hero myth losing its meaning once we become our own individuated person, I would think all of this Jung said this, Jung said that also loses its meaning.
Of course, because then you find your own meaning through your living of your own life experientially.
Yeah.
I mean, the reasons become unreasonable because then you don't need someone else's stuff. You navigate your own ship, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I think they very definitely become actually not meaningless, but I think they become irrelevant. They're wonderful sources and foundations to draw
at the
on,
end of his life, I have no need to believe, which would be believing what someone else says. I know. Okay.
Right.
That's the point. He knew himself
without explanation.
But yet we're all sat here invoking Jung contra Jung. I mean, never mind.
No. I see your point, because also you're bringing up a philosophical point of the integrity of the words in just this paragraph, but then we're insulting, bad Freudian slip. We're inserting bylines of related pieces that actually kind of crowbar it open to add in the pieces that are they're not missing, but they're not presented directly here.
Well, some of it is presented directly, though. I mean, I think we're exploring why at least the translator used the language of young man conducted to the men's house, initiated into the religious mysteries, ushered into a wholly new set of relationships, reborn. All that seems directly related to what my question was about, was there really hazing at that time? And if there was hazing, is it like Shriners? Oh, I'm having Masons.
Yeah.
Well, I gather it might actually be worse.
Masons. Maybe it's my uncle who had the Masonic sign on his everywhere. He wore the ring. He had the
My guess is that it would be actually worse because two things. One, it was done in secret societies. And two, every person that I've known who's of that age, when you mention it to them, they speak encyclopedic volumes in just a glare. And the indelible effects that those experiences had on them, it's almost like war never left them. And so there's a community building device going on there. Maybe not so positive, but it's certainly building a loyalty because we have all been through this kind of thing together.
And it may be a buffer against a lot of what they fear or what they expect might transpire. And that's where one of the things I think he's talking about here is the role of therapy as contrast to that. And the one young person who I know who has joined a Masonic order, and he just turned 32 this month, has a lot of, family trauma, grandfather suicide, lover of grandfather suicide. I mean, mother doesn't speak English, although she still lives in the United States and has raised him as an English speaking person, even though she couldn't speak his language. I mean, and he's a Mason. So it's.
I think that's important to bear because I think these initiations, as it were, hazings, boot camps, etc., they're also interview tactics because they're like a gardener weeding the garden. Because you can't have the chaff in the wheat when you're making bread, or everyone's going to just go, ugh. What's the point? I mean, the bread has to be bread and not a bunch of barley shells. I mean, so you kind of weed that out in the wind through these also, I think, not just as the only reason, but as another additional reason, as an interview piece to purify the group.
Let's just add a point of distinction here that there's clearly a difference between kind of fraternities hazing one another and rites of passage or initiation.
Oh, yes.
Very, very, very different. They don't even belong in the same conversation.
Well, I think the hazing is basically, he used the word inchoate, an undeveloped, primitive, basic, puerile or naive. I think a lot of the hazings are basically poor oral tradition passed down, where the system of the initiation over decades just degenerated and eroded to be just a free-for-all of whatever we could come up with to suffer. Instead of realizing it was a trial, they cause suffering, because trials aren't, I mean, one of the first steps to wisdom is to lose fear. I mean, and I think that the hazing is a digressed form of initiation. So I think you're right. They don't belong in the same group, because the hazing is just kind of like spittle that got spit out of the rite of passage. It's, in a sense, meaningless.
To me, that I or I have never been through a hazing, but because of what we're reading here and they talk about the cathedral and all of that, and I have studied religious text, and so the wording that it is using in here tells me this is something that is centuries old, and it's pertinent today as much as it was pertinent if the people who are reading Carl Jung are from a religious background. And he talked about bold things in this time, which the religious people were not talking about openly. And that, to me, brings us to modern day. And I guess it's part of my life cycle of seeing that. And that's what caught me in that reading. And I couldn't quite figure out what it was until Skip, because I'm so new into Carl Jung, it just put it on a level playing field. So I got it. It was like,
Nick, I think, and that's this
Light
next
bulb.
paragraph, Nick, speaks right to your point of they don't belong in the same group, because he talks about what the young man, little boy, is going through versus what he actually should be going through.
There are two other points of distinction that I'd like to just add here. And one is, again, this is probably something I mentioned before, and I think it's in Joseph Campbell's, magnum opus, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He talks about the point at which, the boy leaves the maternal realm and he's pulled out by the men in the tribe. And I think he's talking about some group of North African tribesmen where, children are born, they live predominantly with their mothers. They stay at home while the men are out doing whatever it is that they do, I suppose, hunting, trapping, etc. And around the point where they hit puberty, they will have been living with their mothers. And the tribe, they orchestrate all of this together, but they'll be asleep one night. They'll be sleeping with their mothers. The men will be off in the woods or out in the desert. They will have made a huge fire. And at this particular tribe, their whole mythology, their god is a snake. So they make this huge fire by a cave. And right in the middle of the night, when the child is sleeping with his mother, they come in, they rip open the door, they literally tear the child away from the mother, and the mother's in on this. They tear the child away, they take him out to this cave, they circumcise him immediately, and they tell him the story about the snake and the god, and they initiate him at that moment into all the religious mysteries of their tribe. But they're also saying to him, you're a man now. You have the ability to procreate. You're playing with fire. You're cooking with gas now. And that's the point at which he's able to understand himself and really understand the gravity of his situation in the world. And I think it's interesting so we've got that on one side. And on the other, there's the issue of group identification. And that's clearly not a bad thing. Nor would it be the case that because he's initiated, he would be identified with that group forever, and he would just be so ensconced in his group identification that he would never develop beyond the point of a man who's just been initiated and takes no responsibility for himself beyond that. Those two things are, it's frustrating because Jung on the one hand has this father complex thing going on. He's deeply introverted. And he's somebody who, now I know this is somewhat of a charged word, but he's privileged in a very, very deep sense. So it's very easy for him to say, oh, poo-poo on every freaking group organization in the world, and you don't need any of that. You just need to be this individuated, rugged kind of individual. I mean, I know that we talk about individuation versus individualism a lot, but the lines cross very often in the way that Jung talks about this thing. And it's almost somewhat poisonous, the way in which he talks about the individual. Sometimes, at least that's my feeling. Because,
well, your privilege is right on the money. His father-in-law was the richest man in Switzerland. So he didn't have any money issues. I mean, he made his own way, but the thing is, he also had the privileged opportunity to do as he pleased. And with that, fortunately, it comes with great responsibility. And fortunately, he took it. Look at how much he did. But I love the way you put in league, or, in the mother's in on this, ripped or torn from the mother, because what's happened is they're doing the secondary cut of the placenta. First, you're connected to your mother with the placenta. They cut that when you're born, but then you develop the connection between you that's not physical, that is kind of a placenta. So as you said, torn away, the community gesture of the mothers are in on it, taken to the cave, circumcised, and told about the story of the snake. The Dogons, the other African tribes that do that, and that is a rite of passage. But like a fraternity hazing, no, not so much. It's just an endurance test.
Okay, I'm going to take exception here. I think that these things are on a continuum, and I've been through both fraternity hazing and joining the Marine Corps, and getting further than that toward individuation. And so, I agree with you, Jordan, that fraternity hazing has become pretty dumbed down in most places, except when you occasionally hear of someone dying in a fraternity hazing, but that's very rare these days. And my experience with it was that it was pretty dumbed down.
Right.
Okay, now, in the Marine Corps, it's definitely, and in all armed services, it's definitely a screening device to determine whether you can hack it. And so it's an ongoing thing through basic training, or OCS. And the purpose of that is to see if you can hack it. And about a third of the people that come to OCS in the Marine Corps leave at their own request. They don't finish. They don't get commissioned. Okay. And it's not because it's so hard. It's just because it's so different from their lifestyle before that, they just don't know how to interact with it, basically. And so they have to go home and get more maturity before they can do it. But, then, you are created in this group context, like the Masons or whatever. I mean, if I were a Mason, I could say, I can't tell you anything about the Masons. Well, I can't really tell you anything about the Marine Corps because you had to be there, right? But then you go beyond that. You have to go beyond that, actually, for individuation. And it's for that reason that the age of an aircraft carrier skipper, the CO of an aircraft carrier, his age is typically 45 years old. Okay, he's just barely getting into the stage of life that Jung would even talk to him, right? And that is because up to that point, you do need the group to, validate everything that you're doing all the way along. Okay, right up to being an admiral or whatever, you have to have the validation of the organization to keep going. If you don't have that, you're done. Um, and but the thing is, people start asking questions by that age 45. They start it's no longer satisfying to them to be so regimented. And so that's why, you know, most people make a general or admiral rank before they're 50. And you know, it's a young man and woman's game. But then, you know, what do you do with the rest of your life? Well, you have to be an individual and do a lot of other things.
You know, Skip, that reminds me completely of the commencement speech that Dr. Michael Jones, the Dean of the Graduate School in Architecture, gave when I graduated. And it was all about the word commencement. And it was all about, this is not the end. This is not the completion. This is for time for you to commence into the rest of your life. At best, what you have achieved is a proper pause today in black dress robes. But tomorrow, it's time to get busy. And so he took commencement not as your graduation was that you graduated to move out into commence into life. So Nick, I cut you off there. Pardon.
No, it's fine. I just want to say that there's very infrequently an adequate ear turned to the nuance in Jung's thought, where Jung never talks about absolute objects, absolute subjects, absolute individual, absolute collective, what have you. They're always in a dialectic. He's not ever saying, now go off and just be an individual, just individuate, because it doesn't matter to the collective. They're always in conversation. They're always in dialogue with one another. And that's why it's kind of frustrating to hear Jung at so many points poo-pooing on groups, saying be this individual, individuate, as if these two things are torn asunder from one another. They're always in conversation, always.
Surely, and that's the way we hold society together, correct? I mean, the people who tend to be Masons or Knights of Columbus also tend to be the leaders of community. You know, typically that's who they are. You know, George Washington was a Mason.
They're also committed to their individual development too. I mean,
surely.
As much about individuation as is Jungian psychology. I mean,
yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is, and you know, the Masons were people who were building cathedrals. That's how they got together in the first place, and you know, they knew something about you know, the trials and tribulations of their craft, but also about having a community that they could survive in when it took 3 generations to build the building that they were working on.
You're right, Nick, that he disparages the groups when he brings them up, always as being this either at the highest level, he puts them forth as an intermediary position, but usually puerile or childish, that it's still not coming into the adulthood. So you're right, he doesn't go absolutes, but he's extremely disparaging to, if he talks about any group, there's going to come a point where it's not more than 2 or 3 paragraphs later, he's going to bring it back up and he's going to take a cannonball at him.
Well, there he is very disparaging and almost in an absolutist sense. But I say that he doesn't talk about absolute subjects, absolute objects. I mean, if you read psychological types, subjects and objects are always in dialogue with one another. They're always looking on one another. And
so Nick, please do understand that the reason that I have done this for the last 6 years is because I felt from my own experience with the material that more people should be conscious of it. And that's why we're here, okay? Because I've continued to do that. I mean, you know, it doesn't mean that you wouldn't go out and do it yourself tomorrow if you wanted to. You certainly have the wherewithal to do that. But the point is that for the last 6 years, I had been feeling why doesn't the Jungian community get this stuff out into the public domain? And so, I admit that I'm flawed in my teaching skills, okay, but nobody else was doing it, so I felt I had to do it. And so anyway, let's read these last two paragraphs through 174, because from 175 he begins with another dream, so we'll finish that next week, but we ought to finish this thought here.
Excellent.
So Annabelle, could you read 173?
Sure. When his mother told him, yes, when his mother told him as a little boy about Cologne Cathedral, this primordial image was stirred and awakened to life. But there was no priestly instructor to develop it further, so the child remained in his mother's hands. Yet the longing for a man's leadership continued to grow in the boy, taking the form of homosexual leanings, a faulty development that might never have come about had a man been there to educate his childish fantasies. The deviation toward homosexuality has, to be sure, numerous historical precedents. In ancient Greece, as also in certain primitive communities, homosexuality and education were practically synonymous. Viewed in this light, the homosexuality of adolescence is only a misunderstanding of the otherwise very appropriate need for masculine guidance. One might also say that the fear of incest, which is based on the mother complex, extends to women in general. But in my opinion, an immature man is quite right to be afraid of women, because his relations with women are generally disastrous. Shall I continue?
Yeah, go ahead.
According to the dream, then, what the initiation of the treatment signifies for the patient is the fulfillment of the true meaning of his homosexuality, that is, his entry into the world of the adult man. All that we have been forced to discuss here in such tedious and long-winded detail in order to understand it properly, the dream has condensed into a few vivid metaphors, thus creating a picture which works far more effectively on the imagination, feeling, and understanding of the dreamer than any learned discourse. Consequently, the patient was better and more intelligently prepared for the treatment than if he had been overwhelmed with medical and pedagogical maxims. For this reason, I regard dreams not only as a valuable source of information, but as an extraordinarily effective instrument of education.
Wonderful.
Yeah, he nailed it right
Nick,
there.
you want to hit that one before you bug out? We're after 10 o'clock, so.
Let's see. I guess the only thing that I can add is that just to agree with Jung in the very end of the paragraph 174, it's so strange how potent and deliberate dreams can be when we are able to kind of sink down to their level or speak their language. I mean, we can't create those kind of things as much as we might like to think we could.
Right, and the psychotherapist is helping you see this is what your unconscious is telling you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, going back to the point of nature not wasting any energy, I mean, think about all the circuitous routes we had to take to get to this very somewhat simple point that Jung concludes with, where it's like with the dream, from the perspective of the dream and the dream maker, it's all very simple. No energy was wasted. It's very succinct, very deliberate, and we have to take the long road around.
Yeah, well put.
Assuredly we do.
Because when he says dreams are an extraordinarily effective instrument of education, in that sense, he uses the dreams to bypass all of the environmental conditions that led to the problems, because the dreams are going to catch him right up. That's where the education is going to happen. And because the dreams aren't afraid of, the upbringing and the misplaced sexuality with the dream of the priests that wasn't present. I like that last part though. Dreams as an extraordinarily effective instrument of education.
I also
We
like.
can't hear you, Jules. You have to unmute.
I was going to say, I say amen to that. I do believe education is the key to it. And when I heard so much reading tonight, I mean, I could have gone off on one sentence for hours and hours, but because there's such a diverse group of people with such different vocabularies, different backgrounds, and different educational things is where it helps me understand sometimes defining something. And so that was to me a perfect example of where we came to a common understanding from many different roads.
We have
Thank
quite
you.
a quintessence here.
Yeah. Annabelle, do you want to say something?
I only wanted to say that it was a really great defense of poetry that he just gave. Instead of long-winded discourse, keep it short, vivid, use metaphor. I'm a proponent of that. I think that's the right word for it.
Well, I like the way you hit it earlier with, music and song and voice and poetry and metaphor, all these things that literally, let me take metaphor out and poetry out, but leave music. It requires no words. And it's the kind of thing where that's dreamlike. And the poetry becomes a language that's dreamlike. And it only becomes poetry, like prose poetry, when we start to dial into explicate it or interact with it verbally. But when you brought up music, etc., and that whole group, and then we end up on dreams as a very extraordinarily good piece for education, tool for education. That I agree. And I hate to say it, I'm a huge proponent of his super long paragraphs, but I didn't notice tonight that they weren't long until you just said that. And I didn't miss them. And now that it's over, I can't miss them because it's too late.
It's all storytelling.
Yeah.
Jewel, will you remind us again, where are you? Geographically?
Good question.
I'm in Flat Rock, North Carolina. Can you tell I'm Southern?
Oh, Black Rock, North Carolina. Yes.
Flat, I hope I said.
Well, my dad used to call the Southern accent and the Texas drawl it's just our American English accent. So he said
working on this.
No. I love it when, for example, I heard Simon Cowell, I think on some audition show, and I think it was probably American Idol or whatever, the newest Voice, or not The Voice, wherever he was. But this little girl came out and she was from South Carolina and she had the drawly twang and she was articulate. And he's British and he's got a heavy British accent. You can tell he's from England. And the first thing he said, he goes, "I love your accent. Oh, the Americans just have boring talk." So I just loved that because I grew up in the South. So, in Texas, I'm the have zero accent kind of place, but that's because just university parents. But I love that he said, "I love your accent." And she just beamed. And then he said other American speakers just have boring language. So I laugh. I'm like, thanks, I'm boring. Thank you guys tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is great.
If I could make one more comment, there's something that just kind of strikes a personal chord with me, and I've tried to somewhat poetically state this myself. And when we were talking about, I think even last week, about the inevitability of using religious language to talk about depth psychology or to talk about one's own experience with their unconscious or whatever language you choose to use. So I'll read the line and then say what I'm thinking. Let's see. Okay. All that we've been forced to discuss here in such tedious and long-winded detail, in order to understand it properly, the dream is condensed into a few vivid metaphors, thus creating a picture which works far more effectively on the imagination, feeling, and understanding of the dreamer than any learned discourse. So a picture working more effectively on the imagination, feeling, and understanding of the dreamer. And I think what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, maybe even last week, was that it's kind of a disservice to whatever is poetic in oneself to talk about, my unconscious, my archetypes, my this, my that, to use all of this psychological language. And I was saying that I almost opt for using religious language because it appeals to something poetic within me. It's almost, it gives color to what I'm trying to say rather than it just being kind of academic language or psychological language or something like that. And I take a very similar meaning from this, where he's saying, this dream is condensed into a few vivid metaphors and created this really rich picture, which almost bypasses all of our discursive thought.
Right.
I just think there's something to that. I think it's helpful for me sometimes to even just write poems about dreams.
Exactly.
Or do something creative with a dream.
Yeah.
Instead of just like sitting and journaling about it, even though journaling can be great. It's up to the dream, I suppose, to tell me what it would like to have done with itself. But I do find that it's almost helpful sometimes to try to bypass the rational mind, the conscious mind, and do something creative, painting, music.
Well, and you can't do that in prose. You have to do it in poetry.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because reasons are unreasonable, and you'll lose it in the prose. You'll beat it to death, or you'll dumb it down. But poetry isn't words. Poetry is music of language, which is different than words. I think dreams, some things need no words. Well, so I write a poem about it. I love that you said that, because I know that if I go into my journal, by the second sentence, I'm off track, because it's inspired me to do something, a new work, instead of write a poem that stays with the image of the poem, or it stays with the image of the dream. And
unless you trick yourself, you can trick yourself into evading that.
Yeah, well, right. But I like the poetry better, so I'd rather not.
No. But I mean, like, I've got just a little package of words.
Oh, nice.
Right. So I just take a bunch of words and then I see what they write themselves.
Oh, that's like I Ching language. That's cool. Dump them out.
It's John Cage, it's burrows cut up, it's a lot of things. But Nick, I think what you were talking about was essentially tapping into source. I think that's where, when you're talking about religion and then you're also talking about creativity, that's where they meet, is tapping into source.
And where psychotherapy meets with it too.
Exactly.
Right. That's the objective. It's the eros. And if you're doing it in prose, that's logos. And the point is that if you're doing it in an eros kind of way, you're doing it with a living thing, not with a dead thing. Because if you're reading a novel, for example, you are reading this word followed by this word followed by this word. But if you're reading a poem, you're imagining what it is the poet is saying, which is different.
Or what
it gets you into your
imagination. Or what they're,
I would. I don't know. As always, I agree with you in the larger part of your statement about logos and eros. But I think one could even make an argument that even poetry might have some logoic counterpart, because
it often does. Yeah,
it's still an graphic expression of an image. You're still not encountering the image behind the poetry exactly.
Right. And so what I say about that is that as soon as you put it down on paper, it's logos. Okay, it's already dead, right? But reading it, if it makes your psyche soar into another place, or it opens up your unconscious, that's what it's supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of my definitions architecturally of to dwell, as in doing residential architecture, is that fortress of feeling place where you turn your psyche inside out. Some people call those things on your shelf your books, your collections. But to me, rather than dead, they're psychic contents that have been put around you from within because they resonate. I'm not going to have something around me that pisses me off, or that is not something that I like, or something that, struck me at some point that, oh, wow, that lit up. I need to buy that. So again, the Logos Eros.
So Patrick Hollywood says, tonight was a great discussion. Thank you. And so thank you all for participating in it. Mm-hmm. And Neil asked this question: is scarcity manufactured or real? It's both.
Well, he's bringing us back around to NFTs. The whole basis of the value is scarcity, rarity.
Right.
Yeah.
But you can, you can trade in blue Bic pens. I have a zillion of them around here, right? You can trade in anything. So if you choose to trade in pixels on a computer, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's really all that greenbacks are anymore. I mean, that's very honestly, your money is really just little green electrons out there. That's all it is. And so
that may be part of ignorance is bliss, where everything is new and rare, and because I don't know anything, and I'm so ignorant that every time I see something, it's like, oh wow, look. So
yeah.
And to me, I agree. That's when I heard about NFT and crypto. Like I said, what if it's it is another commodity?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Trillipodal says Bitcoin and our soul are the most scarce goods, along with time.
Along with time. That's quotable. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Seems to me, maybe I'll sound green by saying this. I don't know, but it seems to me that if on the one hand we take the notion of energy can neither be created nor destroyed, and everything that exists now has always existed, and things are only just changing forms, but then it seems like is scarcity real, but is also value real? Mm-hmm. That we might be creating more money. Well, that just seems impossible within the schema of everything already existing, nothing really being created nor ceasing to exist. And this idea of the creation of value or scarcity existing just seems fictitious.
Well, it's interesting. Scarcity is in the mind of the beholder, right?
Well, I'm glad you said that.
I don't know
because
if that's how that quote goes.
Scarcity is in the eye of the beholder. I used to tell people, well, money is just energy made solid. So maybe that means less energy and more solid, but it means displacement because they're related. So you're right. How to make more, how to make less. I mean, it's how do you tap into source, or your resources.
I'm also aware that if I said that to somebody who didn't have $5 to buy a cheeseburger, they'd tell me to go piss off. But, at the same time, it's kind of, it does seem like once you get beyond the kind of basic levels of resources and material needs being met, it really does get into almost an imaginary realm of value.
Well, that, and then also on the counterpoint, if you want to build value, like I want to build the spirituals, I want to make this much money doing this. So, well, it's way over and above what I need, to build my house, and also then further on the acreage to build a spiritual center. So then what happens though is that's me putting something back into the community. So in a sense, I built value, but in a sense, you're right. I have to come back to say, no, you're right on the money, because I don't have more than I need. Then I have what I need to make those things occur. So in a sense, that's not excessive.
Sir.
It's like you said, though, the miser, I think you're alluding to the miserly part of, the man who might have touched the stars of soul, it sits, counts his money. It's like, wow, you know how to have a Friday night, man. It's like,
I remember when I was really struggling with money when I was about probably 20 years old. I was just living like a dang hippie up here in Boone and didn't have any money. I was eating ramen noodles every day. And I remember I went to see my grandparents for the holidays and they were concerned about me. And, I come from extremely frugal middle-class people that have just worked their entire life and wouldn't spend 75 cents on anything. So they paved a way for themselves. They're very well off now, but they don't, they never would appear that way. Anyways, I remember that they were, I can't remember how it came up in conversation, but I was just saying, standing where I'm standing, it doesn't seem like there's that much of a difference between us. I mean, it seems like the extremely poor and the extremely well off are just at the exact same spot. It's like you get a bunch of money to essentially just get to a point where you don't need money anymore.
mm-hmm.
I don't have any money right now, so what's the difference?
Yeah.
Anyways, I don't know if that's
No, that's a whole other conversation. It's a good one too.
Very definitely. Okay, well, the folks on the YouTube chat have had a very fruitful discussion going. Separate from us, I've dipped into it a few times. But now they're having a frugal discussion on currency and such, and that's a
Nice.
whole different world where I do have my opinions on that. But I mean, maybe some of them sort of wafted in here tonight, but
Yeah, I made sure I was not going to talk about the market or anything like because that's way getting off the paragraph.
yeah. And so, Joel, anything more to talk about tonight? Do you want to say anything more? You don't. Okay.
She's doing it without words.
We're not hearing you.
She's on mute, so she's playing the game. Look at the poetry of no words.
I put my mute on so I couldn't hear you. Said, and I didn't talk about the Confederate dollars worth of other dollars or no. I love it. I love being here. I love the world so big and so wide, and it's all the same because the more it changes, the more it stays the same.
Absolutely. Yep. And our president has the perfect way to unite the country. Let's get into a war, by God. Yeah. Annabelle, any more comments?
No, I'm not gonna comment after that one.
Well, I'm going to bring a little levity. I saw a cartoon this week, and there's a little visitor center on the side of a crater, and it's like, wow, that architect must have won the lottery. Look, perfect placement. That crater, that meteor just missed that building.
I know just the building you mean.
Yep. Yeah, that's.
Yeah. Okay, Nick, do you want to wrap it up here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you expecting me to say something?
Nick will go cut.
I'll take yes for an answer. Thank you. Good night, everyone. I've enjoyed it.
Everybody.
Take care.
Good night.
See you next week.